GitOps with Kubernetes with Dan Garfield.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm serving companies building mission-critical software systems. A quick announcement, we are in the full second year of my architect forums, and you can sign up at the link in the show notes. But if you lead a software team, and if you're looking to collaborate with other peers who are leading groups of software engineers, this group could be for you. We know there's tons of educational information out there for learning how to code and learning how to use technologies and whatnot, but not so much for people who are leading other people who are building code. So that's what this is for. You might be interested. And of course, for those looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Dan Garfield, and he's the co-founder of CodeFresh, which is a CI/CD platform powered by GitOps and Argo, and it's now been acquired by Octopus Deploy, so it's part of that company. And as the vice president of open source and Argo maintainer, he works primarily on Argo CD and Argo Rollouts. He's helped create the GitOps working group and open GitOps Principles. He helped create the most popular GitOps certification with Argo CD, and he writes consistently about best practices for GitOps involving security and development processes and scaling. So, Dan, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, excited to be here and chat about GitOps and Kubernetes and everything going on in the cloud native world. It's pretty exciting right now.
Absolutely. You've done a ton of public speaking. Just, for the listeners out there, if you just search for Dan Garfield, you're gonna get tons of educational content out there. But
you'll get far more than you want.
Right. Exactly. But if we kind of back up, I mean, you were a founder of a company, but even before that, what are the big moments in your career that kind of led you to what you're focusing on today? Are there big moments that stood out for you?
Yeah, I guess I think about like when I was a kid, setting up a BBS and doing dial-up, bulletin board systems, pre-internet, and setting up networking and doing some servers and things like that in my basement. Just always had that interest and always inclined with technology and interested to see what I could do with it. But it was kind of secondary for a very long time. And as I started my career, I started focusing on kind of technical writing topics and things like that. But then I always had kind of a side business where I was fixing servers or setting things, infrastructure up for people. And so that meant I kind of always had my foot in two different worlds. And now coming into Kubernetes and being really focused on that, I was at Atlassian previously, and I was looking at what was going on with containers, and I felt like there was this really exciting revolution happening there. And I was like, I want to be part of this technology revolution that's happening right now. I want to, see where that takes me. And so that was like a really big shift for me to come in and focus so heavily on a new technology and get really deep into it rather than kind of had always been following along in the footsteps of a lot of other people who were paving the way before,
Yeah. And there's so much from bulletin boards to now. That's a whole, multi-decade swath of technology shifts going on.
Yeah.
What was going through your head when you said, hey, I need to start a company. Something needs to change. There's a problem that's out there. It needs to be solved. Other people are not solving it. All right, I need to do something. Do you remember that thought process?
Yeah. So I was looking at containers as a technology, and I was thinking like, okay, we came out with computers that we could use as servers that really fueled, 5 decades of innovation. And then we figured out how to make virtual machines. And that was like, oh my gosh, that's going to get, that's been going on and it's going to continue to go on for a long time. I mean, VMs are basically the foundational component of all this stuff. And so looking at containers, I thought, as pivotal a shift VMs were, and that meant the AWSs of the world, that meant the colos of the world, that meant like this whole change and making it much more accessible and much less expensive for people to get into hosting servers and scaling servers and things like that. We spend money now without blinking an eye that we're like, oh, that's really expensive. And it's like, yeah, you just did the work of like 200 servers and, we're complaining about it. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it is expensive, but also it's cheap. It's really cheap compared to what it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
So looking at containers, I was like, I don't know containers mean yet. I want to find out what it's going to mean and where the most important part of that value chain is going to be and how we can enable people to be part of it. And as we went through that, we found that one of the biggest things that made people get into containers was that they wanted to improve developer productivity. That kind of seems like a side benefit because you're like, oh, containers, they're more portable, it's more repeatable, we have better reliability, you can do more scalability. But at the end of the day, it really boiled down to the most important function at almost any organization is how effective your engineers are at building business value. And if you can remove the barriers from them to do that, if you have that innovation alone, all the other innovations follow. So I was looking around at different groups and I met Raziel, who had just started CodeFresh and had been working on innovating around containers for a while and really narrowing down on the solution. And he laid out his vision for how containers really ended up being kind of the central artifact that you ship. And if you go back to like the old school world of like, I'm shipping a WAR file, right? But a WAR file isn't portable in the way that a container is. And now we're thinking containers plus their configuration plus manifests and all those kinds of things when you're approaching Kubernetes. So I was just really fell in love with that vision. And so Raziel asked me to join and launch this company with him. And that was kind of the big innovation was like, okay, it's containers and what's that going to mean? And from there, we thought, okay, orchestration is going to be a big deal. We looked at all the options. It was like, is it going to be Mesos? Is it going to be Docker Swarm? Is it going to be something else? Is it going to be Kubernetes? And we looked at the fundamentals and we were like, man, I think Kubernetes is going to own this space. And so we basically took all our chips and went all in on Kubernetes from day one. And it turned out that was the right bet to make. And it was pretty substantial, the impact. And people don't remember that OpenShift wasn't Kubernetes and Rancher wasn't Kubernetes. They are now. They're synonymous with Kubernetes now.
Yeah.
But back then, everybody was doing their own orchestration game, and Kubernetes really provides the fundamental building blocks to build any kind of infrastructure and scale and handle all of these challenges that we used to have. And people always say Kubernetes is hard, and like that's true. Like it is hard. It's just easier than anything else to solve the problem. It's like it's the easiest solution that exists, which happens to also be hard. But it's just like once you try to solve scale challenges, and you try to scale up to use 5,000 nodes or whatever, that's a really hard problem to work out. And especially in the old world, you're having to deal with the Raft protocol yourself and figure this stuff out. And it was a bigger challenge, going way back to like Beowulf clusters back in the day, right? Like that was the level of setup that was so difficult. But compared to that, Kubernetes is really easy.
Awesome. So you started CodeFresh and it's been going along. So big news, and we had your business partner Raziel on the podcast. Just episode, we'll include a link in the show. It's episode 294, and he was given the story of the joining the Octopus Deploy team. From your side, what was the strategic excitement about joining a company that largely focused on primarily the Microsoft space since its founding, and they were kind of moving into I would call maybe the Linux native space, which that's everything's Linux native now. But what was the part that was exciting for you in that acquisition?
Yeah, I was really impressed to meet Paul, the CEO and founder of Octopus. I think, if you look at the journeys that we've had between our two companies, Paul bootstrapped. You know, he didn't take funding to launch Octopus. He started as a side gig, side hustle. As he started getting orders, he started, building this kind of groundswell organically, and has had really consistent, fantastic growth ever since. We were kind of the other side of the spectrum. You know, we took some VC funding. We were trying to do big growth very quickly. When you come into a new space, oftentimes you're trying to capture the early value, and so you invest a lot up front to do that. And I think we're still, even with Kubernetes now as ubiquitous, it's still early days. You know, I mean, you think about .NET early days to where it is now. Even 10 years into .NET, it was kind of early days. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think we're still very much on the early, wave for Kubernetes. So we had kind of this different background for how we had grown our companies. And of course, Octopus had been super successful with .NET developers and Windows deployments, but then they had branched out and become very popular for VMs in general. And that's an area that, we had some CodeFresh users that used us for VMs, but truthfully, our big value is for Kubernetes users. There's some nice things you can do from a VM perspective with our platform, and there's some advantages and reasons why you'd want to pick it, and reasons why our customers did. But Octopus's VM capabilities far outshine. I mean, they were focused on it, right? It's their bread and butter. So what we looked at is, hey, we have all of these customers where they have business units using Kubernetes, but they have so much legacy, or as Octopus calls them, heritage applications. These are things that are like, this is our banking software. It's been running for 20 years. We don't want to break it. This is just, we keep it stable, and it's little changes here and there,
right.
Small moves. And it's like, well, we can meet all your Kubernetes needs. It sure would be great if we could meet all those VM needs. And Octopus is in a similar boat where they're like, hey, we're scratching all those VM itches for people, but the Kubernetes itch is something that is newer, and we're trying to get into. And I think that, Paul looked at it and he said, well, we're seeing all these people adopting Kubernetes, and what's their choice? What's the default choice for deploying to Kubernetes? It's Argo CD. And who are the Argo CD players? Who's doing Argo CD? Okay, CodeFresh, they're the first enterprise Argo company. They've been doing it longer than anybody. They've done it in more places than anybody. They're Argo maintainers. Let's have a conversation with these guys. And when we met Paul, it was just like everything just clicked very nicely together. I was super, super happy with how well aligned we were from a mission and a perspective, and kind of a philosophy perspective. So it's been really cool to join that team and start working with them. And, you always worry like, hey, we're going to work on open source. That's something else that, Octopus had done a little bit of open source, some kind of side projects here and there. This is really an open source core business where we have Argo CD is an open source project that we maintain with Intuit and Red Hat and others. So the way that you engage with open source and how you engage with that community, it's different, and it requires kind of a different strategy from a go-to-market standpoint. And Octopus has been super supportive. They're like, hey, you're part of the team now. Let's invest in open source. And so we actually made the commitment to double our contributions to Argo this year. And so far, we're on track to do that. I think we might actually exceed that. So really, really happy with that. And just from a philosophy standpoint, and then from a, I mean, I'm talking about all the stuff that I'm excited about from like me personally. But at the end of the day, from a user perspective, to be able to use the same platform to deploy to VMs, Windows, Kubernetes, and have kind of a unified experience where, the underlying technology, you're making those decisions because they make sense for the applications that you're running. You're not making those decisions just to meet a tool compatibility. I want to be able to use the right tool for the job, and I want my software delivery tools to take care of that for me, no matter where it is. And so being able to offer that experience, I think that's the most exciting component of it, is we're able to bring the entire thing together, and we can focus on it in a way that others can't. You've got companies out there that they do a little bit of deployment tools among a million other things, So it's not their focus. It's a a kind of an afterthought. We're able to focus on it 100%. And I think that if you look at the companies that have been successful in software, you've got Jira. If I want to do issue tracking, I probably just grab Jira off the shelf. Like they're kind of the default option. And if I'm going to do source code management, it's probably going to be GitHub, right? And I think if you want to do continuous delivery, it's going to be Octopus. And so I think that's where we fit into the ecosystem. And I think that that's really exciting for users to have, go to super deep player that can solve all these needs and make it really easy to deliver software. Because at the end of the day, if you can't deliver software, your company's not going anywhere. I mean, you're not making any ground. You're losing ground if you can't deliver software. It's the most important function that a company has right now.
Right.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
I want to just call out and lay the context about the typical .NET developer versus, like you mentioned, war files before, the typical Java developer or Node developer, and the worldview difference. And certainly the early Linux native crowd jumped on containers first. If you were deploying software to Windows servers, you really didn't care. We didn't care about containers at all, because in Linux, certain things would happen. Oh, I got to recompile the kernel, or I'm putting these two things on the same server and they're just stepping all over each other. I need these things to be actually isolated. Whereas on Windows servers, the compatibility story is totally different, where we just don't have that problem. So it's like half the industry is like, oh, Docker containers is so awesome. And then for a long time, the Microsoft side was like, oh, I'm doing some container stuff. Oh, why? Right? Because there wasn't any pain, right? And then .NET said, you know what, let's run everywhere. And now .NET can run on Linux, like, oh, we're going to run Linux. But then, of course, containers is already out at that point. So it's like, if we're going to run on Linux, we're just going to run it in the container. And so now the Microsoft world starts adopting Kubernetes, which is a slower uptick than, I would say, the Linux native side. But for that crowd, can you demystify some of the terms you've thrown around? You've thrown around Argo. We talked about GitOps. You helped with a lot of the standards for both of those. What are those concepts, and can it help us sort out? Because there's a lot of .NET developers who have, maybe it's happening on this half of the industry, but in their world, it's just not a thing. So can you give the primer on what those things are?
Yeah, so let's look at Kubernetes for just a second to start off with, and then we'll kind of expand it. If you look at Kubernetes, what is Kubernetes? It's like, okay, I can run containers there. Great. I could run VMs or containers on just an individual server, right? Okay, well, Kubernetes does a lot more than just run containers. It actually handles the networking infrastructure around those services. It handles ingress, security policy, scalability, storage, all these things. And so if I want to, for example, I've got my service running. If I want to have it running suddenly 50 replicas of that running, so I can handle a much greater scale and have that load balancing automatically take care of it, that's a one character change in my configuration in Kubernetes. I mean, it literally just changed my number of replicas and I'm done, and the big innovation with Kubernetes, and some of this stuff will sound familiar because all these ideas have been around, since the early 90s. But it's really the evolution of technology that's allowed us to make it very accessible. And so some of these things, people will be like, oh, I'm familiar with that. I've done that before. But it's not necessarily that they're the only ones that have done it. It's not ubiquitous, right? So with Kubernetes, Idempotency is baked in, so everything is declarative. So I write my configuration, and that configuration describes how I want everything to run. I don't write a step that says download this container, run this script to start it, run this script to send logs and things like that. Those are imperative operations, right? With Kubernetes, I say, here's the configuration that I want to be reflected, and Kubernetes will try to make that happen. Now, maybe there aren't enough servers available, so it can't actually meet all those needs. That can happen for sure. Or maybe you're trying to use some storage that's not available. Those things can happen, and you'll get alerts that say, "Hey, we're trying to use this storage; it's not available." It'll keep trying it though, and it'll keep trying it basically until the heat death of the universe or your data center runs out of power, whichever happens first. That declarative approach means that I can manage not just my artifact, which is a container, but also all the configuration around it. I almost treat that as an artifact in a sense too. And so you see people shipping like a Helm chart, which is basically a templated or packaged version of a set of manifests to run your service and containers, et cetera. Okay, so that's kind of a lot of stuff. But now that I've got this system running that I can hand configuration to, and it will try to make sure that that happens, the question then becomes, okay, how do I get that configuration onto Kubernetes, right? Because I could fire up a pipeline or a bash script that connects to the cluster's API, uploads the manifests, et cetera. But in the same way that Kubernetes is declarative, it's not imperative, I should have a declarative approach to my software delivery. So this is where GitOps and Argo comes in. GitOps is a set of principles that describe how your desired and actual state should be managed in order to be efficient and effective at running reliable, scalable, and ever-changing services that you can deliver changes to very quickly. So that's what GitOps and the GitOps principles is really about. And for that standard, for those principles, we worked with about 100 different companies in the industry signed on to it, including Microsoft, Azure, GitHub. Those kind of entities were there. AWS was there. Red Hat was there. So we had a really good kind of cross-industry consortium that worked together on this stuff to put together those principles. And we came up with something that was very simple. You can find it at opengitops.dev. And it basically just describes how software state should be managed. And to implement that, we have an amazing tool called Argo CD. And Argo CD is one of the tools in the Argo project. There are others. There's Argo workflows and Argo rollouts, which have different purposes that we're not going to get into right now. But Argo CD basically lets me define a source of truth in Git and a destination in Kubernetes, and it will try to make sure that they're the same. And, if there is an issue where the server goes down, as soon as it comes back up, Argo will be reconnected and pushing again. So I'm not writing all this logic that we used to write in a pipeline to say, okay, do all these retries and then try this and then keep going. And then, here's how to handle these different failure states. This is something we've standardized into the software so we can know, okay, here's how we handle scaling up. Here's how we deliver new changes. Here's how we handle rollbacks. All that's baked in and simple. And then my source of truth is typically in Git. Now, it doesn't have to technically be in Git. It just needs to be any immutable versioned data store. Git is probably the most popular one, and hence the name GitOps. But that means I can basically look in my Git repo, and I have a very high degree of confidence that reflects exactly what's running in production in my other environments. And so that clarity and that visibility suddenly demystifies a lot of what's going on. And I think, we've all had this, even on Windows servers, you've had the experience of having a configuration be misconfigured in a server, and you go to push stuff and it doesn't work properly. And how do you know what configuration is on all these servers? And if I have 5,000 of them, how do I know what's on all of them? You use something like Kubernetes and GitOps, and suddenly there's no ambiguity anywhere. Everything is verified. Everything's clear. If something can't operate, it will keep trying to operate and keep on trying to adjust and get back to it, even if there are little disruptions. And you can also have controllers running to do auto scaling and things like that. But that's a whole nother level of thing to get into. But that's kind of the basic. I don't know if that covers the terms that you were thinking of.
Yeah. So you mentioned GitOps and Argo specifically. You mentioned with GitOps, declarative, versioned, and immutable. But there's a few more principles just to be clear on exactly what is GitOps, which GitOps is not a tool. It's a set of ideas, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can think of it like kind of like Scrum or like the Agile Manifesto. It's that kind of set of ideas. And so with the GitOps principles, the first one is that you want to have your desired state expressed declaratively. I don't want to have a lot of imperative operations. Anytime I'm writing imperative code from an infrastructure management standpoint, I'm setting myself up for difficulty and failure. And we all know, we've all written imperative operations and they can be fragile. Run this command. Oh, that command's not found. What do you do now?
Yeah.
Now you have to build logic around that, and all of the different conditions you have to build around to make imperative operations work. You're much better off using something intelligent like a controller that can take that declarative configuration and then try to make that happen. So number one is declarative. Number two is versioned and immutable. So that means you're storing it in a versioned and immutable data store. So that could be Git. Most often is Git, but it could technically be other things. Number three is pulled automatically. So and these have, if you go to opengitops.dev, there's more explanation on these. I'm giving you the quick version, but pulled automatically just means that you have software agents that are always running that are checking to see if there are updates that need to be applied, and then making sure that that desired state is reflected by the actual state within Kubernetes or any other destination. Now, we talk about with Kubernetes, there's nothing in the GitOps principles that restricts it to Kubernetes. Kubernetes happens to be very good for doing GitOps, but you could do any system that can work declaratively in this way could work. But pulled automatically is important because a lot of times we rely on like webhooks to fire off. And I've seen many situations where for some reason the webhook didn't make it. Maybe there was denial of service going on. Maybe the webhook got misconfigured. Maybe credentials were lost. Whatever it is, we view webhooks as something to speed up the reconciliation process, but they shouldn't be the requirement for the reconciliation to occur. And then the fourth one is that it's continuously reconciled. So it's always looking at the actual state as well as the desired state. So it's not just saying, just apply this, just apply this, just apply this. It needs to be aware of what the actual state is. And that can lead to situations where you say, okay, my desired state in Git reflects X, but one of the things that I have is I have an auto scaler that's running so that depending on the traffic level that I'm getting, it's going to be adjusting the number of replicas that I have. I actually want to leave that in place as I apply my desired state, because that's a dimension that is kind of real-time changing. And so I have sort of a meta state, if you will, that basically says like, I have a policy around how many replicas I should have and what their scale should look like. So continuously reconciling and then attempting to apply that desired state. That's the last one. And that's the one that people most often struggle with because they want to use a click to deploy button.
Yeah.
And you can do that with Argo CD. You can do that with CodeFresh and Octopus, where you can have a button that says, okay, sync this now. And most people start there to get comfortable with it. But once you start thinking, Git is my source of truth, I actually can do the approval on the pull request to actually bring that state in. There's some benefits there. And I think the GitOps principles are there's something that we encourage people to aspire to, but it's also not a club to beat people over the head with. It's like, hey, for your org, maybe you do need a little bit more manual review. You need a little bit more, you're not quite ready to move to Git as the single source of truth. You want to have an approval step or a sync step or something. We want to be flexible so we can meet people where they are, and aspirational so we have a roadmap for where they want to go. That's the GitOps principles.
Well, I'm thinking for the listener who obviously this is brand new to, and who can name the instance numbers or the server numbers or the cloud resource names and keep it all in our head because it's so small that some of these are like, why would you do that? But then you get into a space where you got dozens of services running around, reading messages from queues and processing them, and you need some of them to be scaled to half a dozen, 2 dozen instances, and then come back down dynamically. In that type of world, I don't know how many of what are running at any given time, because it'd be totally wasteful to have the peak load configuration running. And in that case, well, now continuously reconciled and pulled automatically makes total sense, because I don't want to have to do all that manual. I'd be running around pressing buttons the entire day. And in that sense, I'm still safe, because with all of my applications having health check APIs, I'm not going to try to send load to a particular process that's running if something went wrong and it's not healthy at the moment. If, like you said, if it's trying to reconcile something.
Yeah, and that's actually like a big kind of impetus for all of this is the rise of microservices, right? So like if we're coming from a monolithic world, and certainly in the .NET world as well as the Linux world, traditionally we've been much more monolithic. Having like a, hey, click this button, to update the server or whatever, it's fine. It's great. It handles the use case. But when you've got 500 microservices, because you've scaled up and you need to actually have these things scaling independently from an infrastructure standpoint, but also from a team management standpoint, I need them all to be able to be managed by different teams, so we can constantly adding those features and making improvements and bug fixes, and they need to maintain interoperability across versions. Suddenly you get into, okay, I have 500 different microservices. They're all deploying all the time. I need a better, more mature way to manage this. And some of these things, these principles, which sound really simple, when you actually go to like implement it, it's kind of, you're like, oh gosh, we actually haven't been doing that. And this is where it's going to bite us in the butt if we don't. Or like even one that's as simple as a lot of people, when they first adopt Kubernetes, they deploy a service and they just pull the latest tags of their images, and they're like, oh, just pull latest. And it's like, hey, that's great. That means everything's always going to be up to date. What if you want to do a rollback though? And then it's like, oh shoot, we don't know how to do a rollback. Right. We actually have to go and change all of our image tags suddenly. And now how do we manage that state change? Well, this is why all these principles exist. And again, all of these ideas, like, they've been around since the 90s, right? But putting them together and saying, okay, here's the framework, and here are the tools, and here's how you can do it. Suddenly, instead of it being like the top 1% software delivery team, this can be the top 90% software delivery teams can adopt this. Something that's really accessible. What we often call the 9-to-5 developer. You're not cutting edge necessarily. You're like, hey man, I show up at 9 o'clock, I do my work, we ship our stuff, we're rocking and rolling, we feel good about it. I'm not necessarily interested in deploying the latest, greatest, cutting edge, bleeding edge, crazy thing. I want to be stable and standard and methodical. And we want it to be accessible to those people because that's the vast majority of engineering teams, and we want it to be accessible to all of them.
Yeah. It's interesting to think that there are certain pockets of software that you have no idea what the scale or what the load level is going to be, and you have to be absolutely dynamic. But then there's a whole lot of software where you might even have a spreadsheet with all the users' names in them, and you know exactly what your load needs to be, and it's just a different context.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we always joke in the Kubernetes world that someone will show up and they'll be like, hey, I want to deploy a static HTML website. How do I get started with Kubernetes? And we're like, man, it might be overkill for what you're doing. Huck it in an S3 bucket and call it a day. I think you might be done there. I mean, we don't need to go crazy with it, but this stuff is use case driven. Like, you want to use something that makes sense for the tools, and luckily Kubernetes is versatile. I mean, you can host a static website on it, but if that's your only use case, I certainly wouldn't start with Kubernetes.
Right. So with CodeFresh, demystify, as we kind of start to wrap up, demystify where exactly the bounds between Argo and CodeFresh fit in. Because you mentioned the GitOps Git repository. I'm remembering back to over 15, 20 years ago when there were conference discussions about the proper source code layout of a source control repository. And now everybody just has an SRC folder, and there's no rule about it, but it's kind of, people just do it, right? It's accepted. So I'm thinking that is there one emerging for a GitOps repository, and the tools
100%.
Yes. And then what do the tools look like?
We actually have a training and certification that we offer for this called the GitOps Certification for Argo. And you can get it at learning.codefresh.io. And we have best practices for how to organize our repositories. Now, can you be divergent and still use the tools? Yeah, you can. You can go do different stuff. But we find that at least if we put the information in front of people early on, they'll say, okay, this makes sense, and I understand what pitfalls I would be falling into if I take these other strategies. But at least I know what the different strategies are, and can see what's been successful for different organizations. So we start there and let people kind of adjust, where they need to. But yeah, we're totally into that conversation about this is how we should organize our repositories. And from a tooling standpoint, Argo CD as an open source project, you can grab it, install it on a Kubernetes cluster, and start syncing applications from a Git repo, and you're rocking and rolling. You're feeling great. Now, as you scale up into an enterprise environment, you're probably going to find that you want to have more than one Argo instance. So having something that can manage and operate all those together. And now, as a developer, do I have to navigate between these different instances to do my different stuff? How do I know which one to get into? CodeFresh solves that problem right off the bat. But the big thing that we shipped in the last couple of months, well, actually, even before that, we also offer all this traceability, because when you adopt GitOps, you're looking at, okay, here's my latest, Git commit. I'm going to synchronize that change. Well, that Git commit might include updating several images.
Mm-hmm.
Those images, they have a whole bunch of Git commits that have been changed as well. And so there's a lot more history that goes on in doing a deployment with multiple microservices. So CodeFresh provides visibility and traceability and all that stuff. So I can look at my deployment, and I can see, okay, here's the Jira ticket that was being worked on at the application level when this thing was built. So now I have context about what's happening all the time. So that's a big one. But the thing that we shipped recently that has really lit people on fire with excitement and has been environment management and promotion. So I can basically orchestrate and model out how I want to move changes from dev to staging to production, how I want to push changes between different regions, US West versus US East. And I can do diffing. This isn't something that would make sense if you haven't done GitOps, especially at scale. But I have this declarative configuration that describes what my application is supposed to look like in all these different contexts. But I have components that I want to not be promoted between environments. So I have a component or variables or environmental variables or whatever that are like, that's a staging thing. You don't push that to production. They have a separate thing, but I want to promote the other stuff. So you can actually model what kinds of things get promoted and have that diffing reflect that, and an automation that goes into that promotion workflows, so that it's all done declaratively. Even though you might have imperative operations that need to run, those imperative operations are requirements from a declarative standpoint. So we take it all the way down to the infrastructure management level, and I think people see huge benefits from adopting that. So that's kind of the difference between just the community version of Argo CD versus the enterprise version. There's a lot more to it, but that's the 2-minute elevator.
There's a lot of concepts for people who maybe have just used platform as a service, cloud hosting or whatnot, and are thinking, oh, get into Kubernetes, and demystifying like the K3s add-on and the Argo open source project for deploying applications. And then, okay, CodeFresh managing multiple Argo instances. And then, GitOps is a set of ideas with a Git repository format. I mean, there's a lot of concepts that fit together.
There's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, that's true.
for learning, again, with this audience being shipping software on the Microsoft platform, what are the best continuing, where would you point them to? Are there like working reference implementations of like a .NET application that's ultimately going to live in Azure Kubernetes service, and what that kind of structure looks like? What's the best place to push our listeners to learn more?
By far, bar none, learning.codefresh.io. That's going to put you into our training, and you're going to be able to adopt this stuff, get hands-on with a bunch of labs and do the training. And it doesn't take that long. I mean, if you're enterprise and you could do, there's 2 levels available right now. The third one's coming out in a few months. You could do both of the available levels in a day if you were really ambitious. So it doesn't take that long. But once you get hands-on with it, it clicks. It clicks so quick. Once you see how this stuff works, it's like, to me, I started off delivering software by shipping patches in email and emailing it to a sysadmin and be like, hey, can you apply this patch? Doing software delivery this way, it feels like the way it should have always been done. Like, it's so good. It's
Nice.
so good, man. Like, it's such a better experience, and the clarity is so good. So I think, start at learning.codefresh.io and grab the training. It's basically, there's a small fee there, but it's basically just to cover the cost of the labs that we're hosting. And it's so worth it. And we hear every day. I've got people reaching out all the time saying what a big difference it made for them to learn this stuff. And so that's for sure where I would start.
Awesome. Fantastic. We'll include that link in the show notes also.
Sweet.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for coming on the Azure DevOps podcast and sharing about GitOps and CodeFresh and just the whole world. That's a lot of history, and you've been busy.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's been intense, yeah, for sure. And we're not slowing down either.
Awesome. Fantastic. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.